Hello, Finance and Governance Committee members. This is Jennifer Hiraoka, Senior Manager, Internal Controls with an Accounting and Financial Reporting Risk Assessment Update. Our recommendation is that the Finance and Governance Committee receive the Risk Assessment Update regarding accounting and financial reporting as part of the Internal Controls Integrated Framework pursuant to the City of Oxnard Finance Policy 1.05 and recommend that staff forward the presentation to City Council. In December 2021, the City of Oxnard completed the adoption of the Internal Control Integrated Framework policies, which are aimed at strengthening and improving the city's overall control and operating environment. Policy 1.05, titled City Council's Risk Assessment Responsibilities, established that the City Council ensures that risk assessments are performed. The objective of this presentation is to communicate the preliminary results of the targeted risk assessment for fiscal year 23-24 and to present next steps. Agenda. First, we'll review what a risk assessment is and why it's needed. Second, we'll present what was performed as part of the targeted risk assessment, including the targeted risk assessment objectives as they align to the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission Internal Control Framework, referred to as the COSO framework, and what was originally planned versus what was performed. Next, we'll present the targeted risk assessment preliminary results, and finally, we'll discuss the revised fiscal year 24-25 risk assessment plan and the fiscal year 25-26 risk assessment. So let's refresh our memories and discuss what a risk assessment is and why it's needed. A risk assessment identifies and analyzes the risks facing the city as it seeks to achieve its objectives. This risk assessment provides the basis for prioritizing and developing appropriate internal controls to eliminate or reduce risks related to accounting and financial reporting. As I mentioned earlier, the city adopted a financial policy that the City Council ensures that risk assessments are performed. The city's annual audit for fiscal year 2014-2015 produced an audit finding that two types of risk assessments need to be performed: a fraud risk assessment and an accounting and financial reporting risk assessment. In response to the finding, the city engaged consultants Price Page & Company to perform a fraud risk assessment and to perform detailed reviews of reporting and compliance risks of high priority areas. With the implementation of the new Enterprise Resource Planning System, it is important to maintain internal controls, especially those that were put in place as a result of a previous audit finding, which is why the framework and a plan for a targeted risk assessment, which is designed to focus on maintaining existing internal controls, was created. Let's go over the fiscal year 23-24 targeted risk assessment, planned versus actual. Our fiscal year 23-24 targeted risk assessment included reviewing the following processes: vendor master maintenance, grants management, focusing on grants funded by the American Rescue Plan Act Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, or better known as ARPA, and purchasing cards. Due to staffing availability and changing priorities, the capital assets process was postponed and will instead be included as part of the fiscal year 25-26 targeted risk assessment. The fiscal year 24-25 targeted risk assessment will focus on the payroll process. Establishing effective internal controls is a continuous process, which should follow the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, or COSO, framework for designing and maintaining and managing internal controls. Utilization of the COSO framework for designing and managing internal controls is recommended by both the federal government as well as the California State Controller. The system of internal controls has been evaluating using the COSO framework. The 5 components of COSO internal control are control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring activities. The preliminary results of the targeted risk assessment are communicated according to their respective COSO component on the following slides. But before we discuss the preliminary results, let's briefly touch on each of the COSO components. As I mentioned earlier, establishing effective internal controls is a continuous process, depicted by the circular nature of the diagram, which starts at the top of the circle with the control environment. The control environment is a set of standards, processes, and structures that provide the basis for carrying out internal control and sets the tone across the organization. Next, the risk assessment allows management to identify the need for control and monitoring activities, improvements to the flow of information and communication, or the need for changes to the control environment. Control activities are actions established through policies and procedures or through embedded controls that help ensure that management's directives to mitigate risk, as documented in the risk assessment, are carried out. Information and communication is the continual iterative process of providing, sharing, and obtaining necessary information to meet accounting and disclosure requirements under governmental accounting standards. Monitoring activities are the continuous evaluation of each of the COSO components to ensure they are functioning effectively, including in this COSO monitoring activities component is to assess the execution and quality of the established control activities. The next 2 slides contain highlights of the monitoring activities that were performed as part of this review. Now that we've laid the foundation of the COSO framework, let's discuss the fiscal year 23-24 targeted risk assessment preliminary results as they align to the COSO internal control framework. Below are selected highlights of either the internal control enhancements or areas of strength, or areas of improvement opportunities that have been addressed or will be addressed in the future. Please note that these preliminary results are pending discussion with city management. Starting at the top of the COSO framework with the control environment, it has been noted that processes are in a stabilization period post-ERP implementation, and policies and procedures continue to be updated to reflect process changes. Next, for the risk assessment, risk assessments were prepared for the following targeted risk assessment areas to ensure that risks are managed and mitigated: vendor master maintenance, grants management, and purchasing cards. Due to staffing availability and changing priorities, the fiscal year 24-25 targeted risk assessment will focus on the payroll process, and the capital assets process has been postponed and will instead be included as part of the fiscal year 25-26 risk assessment. For control activities, the areas of strength are that the ERP system has the following internal controls embedded into the system: segregation of duties. The system workflow separates the responsibilities for authorizing transactions and processing transactions, replacing the manual control of individuals ensuring that they aren't the only authorizer and approver, or that the transaction is processed by people without conflicting responsibilities. Reviews and approvals. System workflow automation ensures secondary reviews and supervisory approvals that transactions have been properly authorized, accurately recorded, and correctly reflect the events that have occurred replacing the manual control of people routing reviews and approvals appropriately via a paper-based process and approvals being captured on paper. Adequate, accurate, and readily available documents and records. Electronic management of transaction documents ensures that documents are centrally stored. There's a single source of truth. They're accessible across the city, increase transparency, and retained for the appropriate time frame. There are also internal controls embedded into the system for specific processes, such as for vendor master maintenance. Changes to vendor master data is restricted to users with specific roles. For grants management, the ERP workflow routes approvals for expense transactions coded to General Ledger Fund 204, the ARPA fund, to employees with knowledge of approved ARPA projects. The ERP also checks budget when entering purchase requisition or contract, and the ERP limits purchasing transactions to pre-approved vendors. For purchasing cards, the ERP increases transparency of purchasing card statement reconciliation status, as well as the ERP workflow captures approvals of purchasing card transactions. As we go around the COSO framework circle, the final two COSO components are information and communication and monitoring activities. We'll start with the results of the monitoring activities, and then we'll come back to information and communication. Highlights of the results of the monitoring activities that were performed as part of this review are as follows. We'll start with the areas of strength. The vendor master files are reviewed annually, and vendors without activity in the last 2 years are deactivated. The ERP captures approvals of purchases of goods or services, and ERP workflow routes approvals for expense transactions coded to General Ledger Fund 204, the ARPA fund, to employees with knowledge of approved ARPA projects. The ERP also increases transparency of purchasing card statement reconciliation status and captures approvals of purchasing card activities. There are opportunities for improvement or mitigation measures that are in progress. The monitoring activities need to be formalized and documented, separate from this evaluation of the system of internal controls. The vendor master file change management process is reliant on staff to make changes, and a review for complete and accurate information in vendor files should be performed for all vendors post-ERP implementation. For grants management, the process for suspension and debarment review of federal grant funding recipients should be centrally established. For purchasing cards, management should ensure that purchasing card statements are reconciled prior to an employee's last day of work. Now on to the preliminary results for information and communication. The area of strength is that the ERP user quick guides are readily available, and they also incorporate relevant control activities. Training also includes on-demand training for new users. A mitigation measure in process is that the results of this targeted risk assessment or monitoring activities will be communicated to council and to appropriate city staff to improve process efficiency or effectiveness. In summary, the implementation of the new ERP system, Tyler Munis, has enhanced the city's internal controls over financial reporting. The automatic routing of transactions for the appropriate level of authorization, review, approval, and verification, replacing processes that were reliant on people to manually route paper-based or electronic transaction documents for approval, is one of the internal control enhancements. Additionally, internal controls that were initially put into place as a result of a previous audit finding were embedded into the system where appropriate. For example, prior audit finding 2019-007 required the accounts payable team to manually gather and track support for purchasing card transactions. With the ERP, monthly statement reviews and approvals are submitted through the ERP system workflow to accounts payable. Finally, noted improvement opportunities did not constitute control failures due to either the exposures found are minor in extent and nature, or other compensating controls exist. The plan to complete a full risk assessment, which would be compiling a list of all the risks by process for the entire city, will be considered for fiscal year 26-27. The fiscal year 24-25 targeted risk assessment will focus on the payroll process. The fiscal year 25-26 targeted risk assessment processes are the Tyler Munis 2021 upgrade implementation, cash receipts and cashiering, and capital assets, including new additions, disposals, and fleet. This concludes our presentation. We'll return to you in the fall to report the fiscal year 24-25 targeted risk assessment results. Thank you.